No American general ever ordered U.S. Marines to refuse Japanese surrender. No memo, no directive, no written doctrine of any kind. The document does not exist because it was never written. And yet, by the autumn of 1942, thousands of Marines across the Pacific had come to believe that accepting a Japanese surrender could get them killed. That belief did not come from a headquarters. It did not come from a training manual. It came from a beach on Guadalcanal where Marines learned that a white cloth could be a naval flag with the red sun hidden, and the man holding it was not surrendering. It came from what the survivors saw, and from what they told the men who came after them. An order can be revoked, a policy can be rewritten, a lesson learned in blood cannot. On the 8th of January 1941, War Minister Hideki Tojo had issued the Imperial Army its instructions. If alive, do not suffer the disgrace of becoming a prisoner. In death, do not leave behind a name soiled by misdeeds. Every Japanese soldier was issued a pocket-sized copy. Japan had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war, but never ratified it, and therefore never became a formal party to it. The reason given was direct. It was unthinkable that any Japanese serviceman would permit himself to be taken prisoner. The treaty Tokyo concluded would impose burdensome obligations only on Japan. The Americans had no equivalent. What they had instead was what Guadalcanal taught them quietly, without authorization, without a single line of text, and what that teaching became as it moved from island to island across 3 years of war. That is what this documentary is about, not the Senjinkun, the thing that answered it without a document. The night of August 12, 1942, at approximately 1800, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Goettge stepped into a Higgins boat with 24 other men. Marines, a Navy surgeon, a Japanese language specialist named Lieutenant Ralph Corey, who had lived in Japan before the war. Goettge was the 1st Marine Division's intelligence officer. He believed he was going to accept a Japanese surrender. He was wrong. He would be dead within the hour. The intelligence had come from a captured Japanese sailor loosened during interrogation. Hundreds of starving Japanese soldiers near the Matanikau River, the sailor said, were demoralized and ready to give up. A white cloth had been spotted in the jungle west of the marine perimeter. Goettge organized the patrol himself, 25 men, including the regimental surgeon, Lieutenant Commander Malcolm Pratt. They landed near the Matanikau River mouth in total darkness. The white cloth may have been a Japanese flag, either a naval ensign or the national Hinomaru, with the red sun disk folded back or obscured. If the signal had been used deliberately to lure the patrol into an ambush, it constituted perfidy, a war crime under the laws of war. What Goettge's patrol waded toward in the dark was not a surrender. It was a kill zone. Goettge was killed by the first burst of gunfire. The surgeon was wounded and later died. Of the 25 Americans on that beach, 3 made it back. Sergeant Charles Arndt swam approximately 5 miles to safety. Corporal Joseph Spaulding followed. The last to escape was Sergeant Frank Few, 22 years old, from Buckeye, Arizona. Few had been bayoneted through both hands and his right arm during the fighting. He bayoneted one Japanese soldier, in return clubbed a second with a malfunctioning rifle, borrowed Arndt's pistol, and shot a third. Then he entered the water and swam approximately 4 miles back to the marine perimeter. From the ocean he watched Japanese soldiers move through the bodies on the beach with swords. "The Japs closed in and hacked up our people," Few said afterward. "I could see swords flashing in the sun." When Few and the other survivors reached the wire, word moved through the division before dawn. Private Donald Langer heard what had happened. He said, "After this, no prisoners was an unspoken agreement. Not an order, an agreement. The distinction matters. An order can be countermanded. An agreement spread. The use of a false surrender signal, whether improvised by the men on that beach or adopted from the logic of a doctrine that left no room for living prisoners had not been commanded by any written order. It left every gesture of capitulation open to exploitation. What mattered now was what the Marine on the next boat would assume when he saw a white cloth in the distance. He would assume it was a flag with the red sun folded back. That assumption was never issued as doctrine. It had been taught by 22 dead men on a beach most Americans would never hear of, and it would move across the Pacific without a document faster than any official directive because it needed no authorization. It needed only one condition, that the men who learned the lesson survived long enough to teach it. 9 days later, on a narrow exposed sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River Alligator Creek Ocean, on one side river on the other, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 916 men of the 28th Infantry Regiment in a frontal night assault into a Marine machine gun field of fire. He had written the outcome in his diary 3 days before the battle: August 18th landing, August 20th march by night and battle, August 21st enjoyment of the fruit of victory. He was wrong about everything except the date. The sandbar at Alligator Creek was not a defensible position for an attacking force. No cover, no flanking routes, ocean on the right, river on the left. Ichiki's regiment crossed it in total darkness into interlocking fields of fire from Marine positions that had been prepared and sighted for days. Machine guns and 37mm canister rounds tore into the assault from both flanks simultaneously. Stuart tanks were brought up through the coconut grove on the east bank to sweep what remained. The geometry of the kill zone had been visible to any competent officer who had looked at the terrain. Ichiki either had not looked or had looked and decided the Senjinkun's logic overrode it. The battle began at 1:30 on August 21st. By 17:15 and a half hours after the first shot, approximately 800 Japanese lay dead around the narrow sandbar and creek mouth at Alligator Creek. 41 Marines were killed, 71 were wounded, 15 Japanese were captured. The battle was over, and then the killing started again. Wounded Japanese sat up and opened fire. Others pulled the pins on their grenades as Marines approached. A Japanese sergeant lunged at 3 officers, including Lieutenant Colonel Creswell, before being killed. One wounded Japanese officer, believed by some accounts to be Ichiki himself, shot and seriously wounded a Marine who had come to examine him before being killed by another Marine named Andy Polini. Marines who had survived the entire night engagement, who had fought through the darkness and made it to dawn, were killed by men they had walked past, believing them to be corpses. The lesson of the Goettge patrol, 9 days old, was confirmed on a larger scale in daylight in front of an entire division. Shoot the dead was not an order. It was arithmetic. Major General Alexander Vandegrift sat down and wrote a letter to the Marine Corps Commandant Lieutenant General Thomas Holcomb. The letter described what Vandegrift had seen and what it meant. "I have never heard or read of this kind of fighting," he wrote. "These people refuse to surrender. The wounded will wait until men come up to examine them and blow themselves and the other fellow to pieces with a hand grenade." Then he wrote the sentence that required no elaboration. You can readily see the answer to this. He did not write the answer. He didn't have to. The answer had already been given at the Matanikau River 9 days earlier when Frank Few walked back through the wire with bayonet wounds through both hands. Vandegrift's letter acknowledged the cycle without naming it. It described the problem and gestured toward the solution, and left the solution exactly where it had already been placed in the shared understanding of the men who would fight the next battle. What Tanaru did was move that understanding from one patrol to one division. Before August 21st. No prisoners was a lesson known to 25 men on a beach most of the 1st Marine Division had never seen. After August 21st, it was the institutional memory of every Marine on Guadalcanal. Not because a general ordered it, because 800 Japanese soldiers on that narrow sandbar had demonstrated with their own bodies, in the manner of their dying, that the wounded were weapons, that the dying were weapons, that the dead required confirmation before you walked past them. Colonel Ichiki's own end was in keeping with the ideology his army had written. He either died in the final fighting or committed seppuku after burning the regiment's colors. Japanese defense historian records suggest seppuku. One Marine witness account places him advancing toward American lines in the final minutes. The diary entry for August 22nd was never written. The Senjinkun had produced a no-surrender army. The no-surrender army had produced a no-prisoners Marine Corps. No document had ordered either outcome. Both had made the other inevitable. What had crystallized at the Matanikau River on the night of August 12th had been confirmed 14 times over on the Alligator Creek sandbar 9 days later, and it would be confirmed again at a scale that made Guadalcanal look like a rehearsal 14 months after that. On a coral island barely 3 meters above sea level, where 4,500 Japanese soldiers were waiting behind 500 reinforced pillboxes. The cycle was not yet named, but it was running. By November of 1943, the pattern had a number. At Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, the 2nd Marine Division assaulted Betio Island, a coral spit barely 3 meters above sea level, 3.2 kilometers long, fortified with more than 500 reinforced concrete pillboxes, gun emplacements, and bunkers linked by a network of covered trenches. The garrison numbered approximately 4,500 men, commanded by Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki. Shibasaki had told them what to expect. It would take 1 million men 100 years to conquer Tarawa. He was wrong about the timeline. He was not wrong about the rate. The landing on November 20th, 1943, began before the Marines reached the beach. The reef surrounding Betio extended 800 to 1,200 meters from the shoreline. Landing craft grounded on the coral in chest-deep water, hundreds of meters short of any cover, and the men inside them climbed over the sides and waded. 500 meters of open water. Chest-deep, then waist-deep, then chest-deep, again as the coral shelf dropped and rose. Japanese gunners on the beach and in the offshore bunkers had pre-sighted the reef approaches. There was no cover on the reef, no route around it. There was only forward into fire that had been waiting for exactly this geometry. The men who made it to the seawall, the men who actually reached the island, did so because the men who had crossed the reef ahead of them had drawn the fire and died absorbing it. That is not a figure of speech. That is the tactical arithmetic of Betio you survived by advancing over the positions of men who had not. The battle lasted 76 hours. When it was over, 1,009 Marines and 30 sailors were dead. Another 2,292 had been wounded. 88 were listed as missing. In 76 hours, 3 days and 4 hours, the 2nd Marine Division suffered more killed in action than the entire 1st Marine Division had in 6 months on Guadalcanal. And 17 Japanese military personnel had surrendered. 17 out of 4,500. Rear Admiral Shibasaki was not among them. He died on November 22nd. The precise circumstances remain disputed, with some accounts placing him at a command post, destroyed by naval gunfire, others suggesting he died leading a counterattack, but he died. The rest of his garrison died with him, or before him, or after him, by the same logic that had sent Ichiki's regiment across the Alligator Creek sandbar 14 months earlier, that death was preferable to the disgrace of capture, and that a man who allowed himself to be taken had ceased in the eyes of the Imperial Army to be a man at all. The number 17 requires a moment. It is not a percentage. A percentage softens. It rounds the edges, makes it a statistic that can be compared and contextualized and set aside. 17 is a head count. You can picture 17 men. You can fit 17 people in a large room. 17 Japanese military personnel surrendered out of a garrison of 4,500 in 76 hours of combat on an island the size of a large airfield. The other 4,483 chose the only alternative the Senjinkun had left them. Some died in fighting. Some died in the water trying to escape by night. Some in the final hours detonated their own grenades. There is an additional number that belongs here. Of the 17 who surrendered, most were found unconscious or physically unable to resist, too badly wounded or too deeply concussed to make the choice the doctrine required. The number of Japanese at Tarawa who made a deliberate, conscious decision to lay down their weapons and walk toward Marine lines with their hands raised was by most accounts close to zero. There were also approximately 129 Korean laborers captured on Bateau-men the Imperial Army had conscripted for construction work, not combat. They were not included in the 17. The distinction matters in the accounting of the Pacific War. The men who chose surrender and the men who were simply found alive were not the same category, and the gap between the two numbers tells you something about what the word surrender had come to mean in this theater by the end of 1943. The Marines who waded to the Bateau beach had learned Guadalcanal's lesson. They had landed expecting the wounded to be weapons, the dying to be weapons, the apparent dead to require confirmation. What Tarawa confirmed was not simply that the lesson had been correct. The lesson had always been correct from the moment Frank Few swam away from the Matanikau River with sword cuts on his hands. What Tarawa confirmed was that the lesson was now structural. It was no longer the response of 25 men to one ambush on one night on one island. It was the predictable, measurable statistical outcome of a system in which two opposing doctrines, one printed and distributed, one spoken at a wire in the dark, had locked together and begun feeding each other. The Senjinkun produced soldiers who would not surrender. Soldiers who would not surrender produced Marines who did not expect surrender. Marines who did not expect surrender produced conditions in which genuine surrender was nearly impossible to execute safely, even when a Japanese soldier attempted it in good faith, because the Marine facing him had been taught by experience that the attempt was never in good faith, which produced more Japanese soldiers dying rather than attempting it, which deepened Marine certainty, which made the next attempt less likely still. 17 out of 4,500 was the number that made the cycle visible as a cycle. Among the very few documented cases of organized Japanese military surrender before August 1945 was a small unit in New Guinea men whose officers had confiscated their food supply, leaving them with nothing left to fight with and nothing left to fight for. That was the condition under which organized Japanese military surrender became possible. The complete removal of every other option. At Tarawa, the walls of that system had become visible as numbers. They would become visible as something else, something that reached beyond soldiers, beyond doctrine, beyond the battlefield itself. 8 months later, on a limestone cliff at the northern tip of an island in the Mariana Islands, where civilians who had never held a rifle, had never read the Senjinkun, and had never sworn an oath to the emperor, would nonetheless act as though they had. No order had produced the number 17. No written doctrine had commanded 4,483 deaths. Saipan was different. The island in the Mariana Islands, assaulted by U.S. forces beginning in June of 1944, was the first major Japanese-held territory in the Pacific with a significant civilian population, Japanese settlers, Korean laborers, and indigenous Chamorro people who had lived under Japanese administration since the First World War. By the time the fighting reached the northern end of the island in late June, the battle was no longer only about soldiers. The imperial government had prepared the civilian population for what was coming, not for surrender, for death. Leaflets had told them that American soldiers would torture them, rape them, devour them. That capture meant a fate worse than anything the fighting could produce. The Senjinkun had been written for soldiers. No one had formally extended it to the farmers and fishermen and schoolteachers of Saipan. They had simply absorbed the same logic through a decade of government propaganda, until it became indistinguishable from belief. On July 7, 1944, 2 days before the island was declared secure, the largest banzai charge of the entire Pacific War rolled out of the northern end of Saipan. 4,311 Japanese soldiers, many of them walking, wounded, attacked the 105th Infantry Regiment before dawn, nearly destroying its 1st and 2nd battalions. Among the Americans killed was Lieutenant Colonel William J. O'Brien, commander of the 1st Battalion. It took the better part of a day to stop them. The charge accomplished nothing tactical. It accomplished everything ideological. Time magazine asked its readers the question that the suicides at Marpy Point would sharpen further. Do the suicides mean that the whole Japanese race will choose death before surrender? The imperial government allowed the question to be reprinted in the Asahi Shimbun. They used it as propaganda. At Marpy Point, at the northern tip of Saipan, the limestone cliffs drop 60 to 80 meters to the rocky shoreline below. There is no sand at the bottom, no beach, only the cliff face, and below it, the Pacific Ocean, breaking against coral and stone. In the final days of the battle, the island was declared secure on July 9, 1944. Hundreds of civilians gathered at Marpy Point and at the adjacent shoreline. What happened there had no military objective. The battle was effectively over. There were no tactical gains available. The ideology, having run out of soldiers to consume, turned on the people who had been living inside it. Families waded into the surf together. Women held children above the waterline until they could no longer stand. Men detonated grenades in groups. A Japanese sniper positioned on the cliff face shot civilians who tried to turn back toward American lines, picking off the ones who hesitated, who perhaps had weighed the propaganda against the evidence of American soldiers they could now see on the beach below, holding out food and water, shouting in Japanese for them to come down. The sniper was eventually killed by Marines who had watched him work. He was described by witnesses as having been literally disintegrated by the fire that ended him. The propaganda had named the Americans as monsters. The Americans moved destroyers closer to the shoreline to rescue people from the water. A Marine was photographed that afternoon sitting on a road near Marpy Point. He was covered in battle grime. There was blood on his face from the fighting. He was holding a 6-year-old girl in his arms, a Japanese child he had carried back from the beach. There were tears on his cheeks. It was the same war, the same beach, the same afternoon. The Senjinkun had told 2.3 million soldiers how to die. It had not been written for that 6-year-old girl. But the logic did not require her to have read it. It had been in the air of Saipan for 20 years, carried in the language of every official broadcast, every school lesson, every government instruction about what Americans were and what surrender meant. By July of 1944, it did not need a document to operate. It had become the operating assumption of an entire civilian population, and it had led them without orders, without a commanding officer, to the edge of a cliff 60 meters above the sea. No order had spread it this far. No document had written it into the lives of the farmers and fishermen and schoolteachers of Saipan. What spread instead through a decade of government propaganda, through a logic that needed no authorization to operate, had now run past the edge of the battlefield entirely. Nobody was paying attention to a 20-year-old mortarman from Mobile, Alabama, when he stepped off a landing craft onto the coral beach at Peleliu on September 15, 1944. His name was Eugene Sledge. He kept notes in the margins of a pocket New Testament. Those notes would eventually become the most unsparing enlisted account of the Pacific War ever published, a book the Marine Corps placed on its official reading list, a book that makes no attempt to justify what the Pacific War did to the men who fought it. Peleliu had been predicted to fall in 4 days. maybe 3. The island was taken in 73 days. The Japanese garrison on Peleliu, approximately 11,000 men under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had abandoned the banzai charges that had broken Japanese infantry at Guadalcanal and Tarawa. Instead, Nakagawa had spent months converting the Umurbergal mountain into a fortress of approximately 500 interconnected caves and tunnels cut through the jagged coral ridges. Ground temperature on the coral reached 46 degrees Celsius. There was no shade and almost no fresh water. The caves had mutually supporting fields of fire. You could not advance on one without being shot from 3 others. By September 1944, the Japanese had learned how to make the terrain itself into a weapon, and the Marines of the 1st Division had to go into it cave by cave, tunnel by tunnel for 2.5 months. The U.S. suffered approximately 9,800 casualties on Peleliu, 1,800 killed, 8,000 wounded, a 40% casualty rate. Of approximately 11,000 Japanese defenders, 202 were captured. 19 were Japanese combatants. The other 183 were Korean and Okinawan laborers, men who had been brought to Peleliu to dig the tunnels and had no ideological stake in dying in them. 19 Japanese combatants out of 11,000 chose something other than death. Eugene Sledge watched what the other 10,981 chose and what it produced in the men around him. He wrote about it without euphemism. "We never took prisoners," he recorded in With the Old Breed. "Even when some few tried to give up, they often tried to throw a grenade at us. After taking a position, we routinely shot both the dead and wounded enemy troops in the head to make sure they were dead." The Japanese had booby-trapped their own dead. They had booby-trapped dead Marines. A body, any body, was a potential weapon. The rational response to this inside the logic of Peleliu was to confirm every body as definitively dead before moving past it. The practice had begun at Tenaru as a response to a specific incident. At Peleliu, it was no longer a response. It was a protocol. Sledge did not pretend that pure tactical necessity explained everything he witnessed. He wrote of a brutish, primitive hatred, a collective attitude, he said, that resulted in savage, ferocious fighting with no holds barred. He named it. He did not absolve it. He did not explain it away. In May of 1944, 4 months before Peleliu Life magazine had published a photograph of a young American woman at a desk writing a letter. On the desk in front of her was a human skull. The caption identified it as the skull of a Japanese soldier sent to her by her boyfriend in the Navy. The image ran on the cover. It became one of the most discussed photographs of the war evidence many argued of American racial dehumanization of the enemy. In 2025, the family of the woman in the photograph confirmed that the image had been staged. Her name was Natalie Nickerson. She had no boyfriend in the Pacific. It had been a modeling job. The skull's provenance was never established. The photograph, which had been used for decades as uncontested evidence of American trophy culture, turned out to be a piece of wartime staging. The staging does not erase what actually happened with human remains in the Pacific Theater. The Army-Navy Journal reported it. Roosevelt was presented with a letter opener made from a Japanese soldier's arm bone by a congressman and ordered it returned. The U.S. Army Judge Advocate General, in a memo dated June 13, 1944, written 3 months before Peleliu, had already called the mutilation of enemy dead repugnant and a violation of the Geneva Convention, and had warned that it could carry the death penalty. No documented prosecutions followed. The government saw it, named it, warned of consequences. And then the cycle continued into Peleliu, into Iwo Jima, into Okinawa, without a single prosecution in the record. The JAG memo was not an order to stop. It was an institutional acknowledgement that something was happening that no institution had ordered and no institution was prepared to address. On Iwo Jima, the Japanese learned one English word. Not a command, not a warning. The one word in any battlefield that was supposed to guarantee safety, the word written into the laws of war, protected by the Geneva Convention, the word that had for generations meant this man is trying to save a life, not take one. Corpsman. They screamed it from tunnels and shell holes cut into the black volcanic rock. In English, deliberately. And the Navy medics came running. Iwo Jima, D-Day, February 19th, 1945. 0900 was defended by more than 20,000 Japanese troops under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who had studied the failures at Guadalcanal and Tarawa and drawn the correct tactical conclusions. No banzai charges. No exposed infantry assaults across open ground. Instead, Kuribayashi had spent 8 months building more than 11 miles, nearly 18 kilometers of tunnels beneath the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, a network connecting 1,500 rooms, command posts, ammunition depots, and fighting positions that could shift defenders from one part of the island to another without ever surfacing. The black volcanic ash beach was a 15-foot terrace that landing craft could not climb. Marines came ashore and immediately sank to their ankles in ash that was still warm from the geothermal activity below. The tunnel network meant that positions the Marines captured in the morning could be reoccupied from below by afternoon. It meant that the dead Japanese, dead Marine dead, could not be relied upon to stay where they had fallen. And it meant that corpsmen could emerge in English from a shell hole 50 meters behind the Marine line. The corpsmen removed their Red Cross insignia. Pharmacist's mate. Second-class Stanley Dabrowski explained what it had come to. We carried medical kits, which I didn't like at all, because they marked us as corpsmen. Because of this, we were told to carry sidearms not as offensive weapons, but for self-protection. The men whose only job was to save lives, who were supposed to be protected by the most fundamental provision of the laws of war, were now the primary targets on the battlefield. 332 Navy corpsmen were killed or died of wounds on Iwo Jima. 659 were wounded. In 6 battalions, casualties among corpsmen exceeded 50%. In 1 battalion, 68% of the corpsmen were killed or wounded. 4 Navy corpsmen received the Medal of Honor on Iwo Jima out of 27 total Medals of Honor awarded in that battle, the most of any engagement in the Second World War. On February 20th, 1945, D+1, the second day of the battle, Private First Class Jacqueline Lucas was 17 years old. He had stowed away on a troop ship to get to Iwo Jima after being told he was too young to deploy. He had lied about his age to enlist at 14. That day, in a trench on the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, he threw himself on 2 Japanese grenades, simultaneously covering both with his body to absorb the blasts and protect the Marines around him. He survived with more than 250 shrapnel fragments in his body, requiring 26 surgeries over the following years. He became the youngest recipient of the Medal of Honor in the Second World War. He was 17 years old. He had not been legally old enough to be there. 8 days later, on February 28th, pharmacist's mate, 3rd Class John Willis, was treating a wounded Marine in a shell hole on the volcanic rock when Japanese grenades began landing around him. He picked up the first one and threw it back. He picked up the second and threw it back. The third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the 7th, the 8th. His Medal of Honor citation records what happened next. He hurled back 7 more in quick succession before the 9th one exploded in his hand and instantly killed him. He was 23 years old. The cycle had now consumed the category of person that every version of the laws of war across every century of modern combat had agreed was to be protected above all others, the man trying to save lives. It had consumed him not as a side effect of the fighting, not as an accident of proximity to combat, but deliberately as a tactic implemented because the cycle had taught the Japanese that Americans would run toward that word, and taught the Americans that they could not fully trust the word when they heard it in the dark. There is a name that belongs here, though it is not in the Medal of Honor citations. Private First Class Dale Birch reported what American forces found when they recovered the body of Private First Class Theodore J. Ignatowski from a Japanese tunnel on Iwo Jima. Ignatowski had been captured alive. What was done to him after capture, documented in witness testimony, constituted a war crime under every framework the laws of war had ever produced. What matters here is the category, a prisoner, a protected person under the Geneva Convention tortured to death. John Willis, the corpsman who threw back 8 grenades before the 9th killed him, died on the same island where this was done to an American prisoner in the same week. The cycle ran in both directions. Navy pharmacist's mate. John Bradley received the Navy Cross on Iwo Jima for his work treating the wounded under fire. He went home. He opened a funeral parlor in Antigua, Wisconsin. He did not speak about Iwo Jima, not to his wife, not to his children. For 50 years he carried what he had seen, what he had treated, what he had found, what the word corpsman had meant on that island, without ever putting it into a sentence anyone else could hear. Of more than 20,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, 216 were captured. Most were unconscious or physically incapacitated when found. The number who made a deliberate choice to surrender, who walked toward American lines with their hands raised and their eyes open, was smaller still. The cycle had inverted the most fundamental protection in warfare. It had made the act of healing into a liability and the word for help into a weapon. When that is what a war has become, it is no longer a question of doctrine or policy or written orders. It is a question of what comes next and whether anything can reach far enough into the logic of the cycle to slow it down. The cycle had no official origin and no official response. It had not been ordered. It had not been prosecuted. It had spread instead from Guadalcanal to Tarawa to Peleliu to this black volcanic island until it had consumed the most protected category in the laws of war. Something was being written to address it, not on a Pacific island, in a headquarters. By March of 1945, the psychological warfare branch had identified the problem, and the problem, it turned out, ran in both directions. The Japanese words for surrender kosenkofuku were so freighted with shame that no Japanese soldier would read a leaflet containing them and consider the instruction. The Senjinkun had made surrender a category of disgrace, so total that the language used to describe it had become psychologically toxic. You could not ask a Japanese soldier to kosan. The word itself was the barrier. It meant not just give up, but cease to exist as a person of honor, and 3 years of war, and Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Peleliu and Iwo Jima had demonstrated with arithmetic precision exactly what happened to Japanese soldiers who tried to cross that barrier. But the barrier was not only on the Japanese side. American troops on Okinawa, where U.S. forces landed on April 1, 1945, across a 15-kilometer front at the Hagushi beaches on the western coast of an island 106 kilometers long, had been trained by 3 years of perfidy to shoot first and investigate nothing. Okinawa had a civilian population of more than 300,000 living in a landscape of limestone karst caves that the Japanese Army had spent a year fortifying. The Shuri Line, anchored on the stone walls of Shuri Castle, channeled every Allied advance into killing corridors prepared for exactly that purpose. The Bayou rainy season hit in May, mud that stopped vehicles, collapsed trenches, and made the coral of Iwo Jima seem navigable by comparison. A Japanese soldier emerging from a cave with his hands raised had, by the logic of the Pacific War, roughly the same probability of being genuine as a white cloth on Guadalcanal in August of 1942. The psychological warfare branch understood that any solution had to address both ends of the cycle. Simultaneously, the Japanese soldier taught that surrender was death in life, and the American Marine taught that surrender was a weapon. The solution was a piece of paper. Beginning March 25, 1945. Approximately 8 million leaflets were dropped over Okinawa and the surrounding islands. The leaflets used neither kosan nor kofuku. They used a phrase developed in consultation with Japanese prisoners of war who had advised the psychological warfare branch on what might be survivable, teiku wo yamemasu. I cease resistance. Not surrender, cessation of resistance. The distinction was engineered to reduce the shame load of the act to something a Japanese soldier might, in extremis, be able to perform. The leaflets came with instructions: stripped to the waist to prove no concealed weapon and no concealed grenade. Hold the leaflet on a stick raised above cover. Walk slowly toward American lines. The mechanics of the Safe Conduct Pass had been designed to make it physically impossible to execute a suicide attack while following them. You cannot pull a grenade pin with your hands above your head and a stick in one of them. The pass was not only a message to Japanese soldiers. It was a protocol designed to make American soldiers believe the message was genuine enough to hold fire. And here is the detail that the psychological warfare branch's own analysts noted, and that the documentary record confirms. The English text on the leaflets, "I surrender," printed in large type, was partly there for American eyes. S.G.M. Herbert Friedman, a SWIOP analyst who later studied the Okinawa campaign, was direct about it. There is reason to believe that 6th Army HQ wanted the "I surrender" text in large type so that the American soldiers would see the words and hold their fire. The leaflet had been written to stop Marines from shooting. 3 years after Guadalcanal. 3 years after the unspoken agreement that had never been ordered and never been prosecuted, the agreement that the JAG had called repugnant in June of 1944 that had consumed Tarawa and Saipan and Peleliu and Iwo Jima. Without a single documented prosecution, the institutional response was a piece of paper designed to tell both sides the same thing in different languages: stop. It worked. Partially. On Okinawa, approximately 11,250 Japanese military personnel surrendered about 11 to 12% of the garrison. Before Okinawa, the surrender rate for trapped Japanese garrison soldiers had been roughly 1%. The prisoner-to-dead ratio in late 1944 had been approximately 1 to 100. By mid-1945 on Okinawa, it had improved to approximately 1 to 7. A 14-fold improvement. In a war where the denominator had been at Tarawa 4,483 dead for every 17 who chose otherwise. A 1 to 7 ratio was something that had not existed before. But even on Okinawa, Japanese soldiers shot at American stretcher teams. Civilians in the limestone cave systems of the Shuri Line, which had anchored the Japanese defensive perimeter through months of monsoon mud and close-quarters fighting, still held 2 grenades, one for the enemy and one for themselves. Mothers still made decisions in the dark about their children that the Senjinkun's logic had made available to them. The cycle had been slowed. It had not been closed. 11 to 12% means 88 to 89% did not. 11,250 people walked toward American lines with the leaflet held on a stick. Approximately 90,000 Japanese military personnel on Okinawa did not. It was still not redemption. It was a measure of the distance the cycle had traveled and the distance it had yet to go. On July the 25th, 1945, 12 days before the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a U.S. Marine Corps photographer took a single photograph on Okinawa. It shows a United States Marine standing in the open, one arm raised, signaling his squad to hold fire. In front of him, a wounded Japanese soldier is emerging from a cave with his hands up. The Marine is not behind cover, not at the edge of a trench. In the open, the most exposed position on the battlefield, arm raised, back partially turned to the cave. The official caption recorded what had changed. Earlier in the war, Japanese who surrendered amounted to roughly 1% of total enemy troops killed or captured. On Okinawa, the percentage had climbed to approximately 11 to 12%. That is the institutional story, 1% to 11. 3 years of the Pacific War condensed into a number that still has 88% on the wrong side of it. The Marine in the photograph does not know if the man coming out of the cave has a grenade. He cannot know. The Japanese soldier knows what happened to the men on the Goettge patrol in August of 1942 because the Marine in front of him knows what happened to them. The knowledge has been in the bones of every Marine in the Pacific since Frank Few walked back through the wire with bayonet wounds through both hands. The Marine is standing in the open anyway, with his arm raised. That is the answer to the question the title asked. Not in a document. In a gesture on a hillside on Okinawa less than 2 weeks before the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 years of the Pacific War, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and the 76 days of Okinawa to get from no prisoners was an unspoken agreement to a Marine standing in the open with his arm raised. The order was never written. What spread instead was worse. And what finally began to stop it partially imperfectly at the cost of all of that was not a countermanding order. It was a redesigned word and a man willing to stand in the open. Eugene Sledge went home to Mobile, Alabama. He earned a doctorate in biology. He taught ornithology at the University of Montevallo. He could not go hunting. His father found him weeping over a wounded dove he had shot, unable to finish what he had started. He gave up hunting entirely. He wrote, with the old breed, at his wife's insistence, because she believed the record needed to exist. He did not disagree. William Manchester, who served with the 29th Marines and was wounded on Okinawa, began having nightmares 23 years after the war ended, not in 1945, not in 1950, but in 1968, when whatever had been holding the memory in place finally gave way. He traveled back to every Pacific battlefield he had fought on, trying to locate something he had left there and could not name. He wrote about it. He still could not name it. John Bradley went home. He went quiet. He opened a funeral parlor in Antigua, Wisconsin. He carried what he had seen on Iwo Jima for 50 years without giving it a sentence anyone else could hear. He died in 1994. The order was never written. Neither was the cost. What the photograph shows a Marine in the open arm raised, choosing trust over 3 years of evidence, is not a resolution. It is a data point. The most expensive data point in the history of the Pacific War. It is the most human thing in this story. It is the most dangerous thing a Marine could do.